Good afternoon, everybody. Back with James for the book club.
Howdy.
This month, Strange Frequencies by Peter.
You want me to say it?
Yeah.
I think Bebergal. I'm gonna say that.
Bebergal. Anyway, very interesting book. Kind of builds nicely on the last one. So, James, shall you introduce the book, please?
Sure. Yeah. This is. Do you know anything about this guy? He's written for like magazines that you might be familiar with, and it feels like a very magic magazine prose.
Yeah, he's definitely a journalist. I don't know much about him. I only learned about him from another podcast where he was interviewed.
Right.
Yeah.
So the book is like Strange Frequencies is a reference to like the EVP community, I think, pretty explicitly. EVP being like electronic voice phenomenon, which is a set of different things that people do to like record the voices of ghosts, basically, in different ways, or like communicate with the dead through electronic means like telephones and apps and recorders and stuff. Oh, that's right. There's some electronic voice is the non-committal version, right? So a voice could be the dead, could be from outer space, could be from the center of the planet or whatever, right? But so that's the Strange Frequencies. But more broadly, the book is about intersections of spirituality and technology. And in the introduction, maybe I'll just go straight to this. He sort of defines his subject as technological ascendancy is the term that he uses. Technological ascendancy, which sort of has these four component parts, I believe. Maybe there's more, or maybe I'm overlapping things, but he sort of suggests that he's going to look at instances of technology as spiritual growth, technology as mastery over the physical world, technology as magic, and technology as the means to harness divine energy. And those sort of four sort of overlapping layers are kind of where this book lives, right? Does that seem about right to you?
Yeah. I mean, towards the end of the book, he uses the term Promethean. To me, that seems like the sort of archetypal motif that's running through it.
Right.
Humanity taking the fire from the gods.
Right. For their own purposes, and then right. And that being an instance of technology and spirituality being together, right?
Yeah.
We got fire from the gods, and now we can do all this other stuff. We can make iron,
right?
Cook our food.
To what extent is our own creativity God-like?
Right. That's sort of the definition. At first, I had trouble getting into this book because of how he sort of outlined that definition of spirituality and technology. I think because, like, the notion of spirituality or technology is spiritual growth, but then also spirituality is like mastery over the world, seem to be at odds to me. Like, right? My experience in 12-step recovery and its emphasis on things like surrender seem to be at odds with this idea that I'm going to grow spiritually by expanding my personal agency and its claims over other things, rather than sort of accepting the limits of my personal agency and expanding my sense of relationality.
Yeah.
Right.
So in that sense, it runs kind of parallel to some of the more disturbing aspects of Horowitz's book, where spirituality was there to enrich or endlessly improve the individual.
Right. Yeah. It's very much that, like, the self-improvement, like technology as self-improvement and technology as a means to gain power over things we don't fully understand. Right.
Yeah. And it's really funny, just like the Horowitz book, when I went back in it to prepare for this, I found myself disturbed in the rereading in a way I wasn't in the initial reading. Trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
So give me first impressions then, and then we'll talk about rereading. First impressions was fun?
What's that?
Like fun would be my guess, right?
It was a lot of fun, but some things were more fun than others. So by far, the most interesting chapter to me was the one on the automata.
Right.
We can talk about, he calls it In the Uncanny Valley of the Dolls.
Yeah.
And then he does these other things in here where he's really kind of pointing out, maybe not too explicitly, but it's there to see that spiritual technologies don't have to be metal and electrical. Spiritual technologies can be using grimoires to animate statues, or divinatory tools, or LSD. You know, these are all technologies. Meditation is arguably the most common technology.
That's interesting,
But then as the book went on and we started getting into these really specific modern technologies involving cameras and recording devices, and then it started getting, I don't know how to describe it. It got disappointing. And I found myself thinking about your objection quite a bit, meaning, what's the difference between trying to take heaven by storm versus these other more traditional spiritual paths that say something like, you need to purify yourself, you need to become worthy of this endeavor. You know, like Rudolf Steiner often says, for every step you take in the spiritual world, you have to take 3 in the moral world, in your moral development.
Right.
And so this did seem pretty wild after a while.
Right. Kind of reckless in that sense. Definitely not following the Steiner.
Yeah, it seemed very reckless. And very American, a lot of it, even though not all of it was.
Right.
So things like Robert Monroe, that was kind of interesting. But that, you see, the other thing about the book that was really interesting is, it's basically a series. The chapters are all stories in a way, but then there are things within the chapters that could be whole other chapters. And so there's little anecdotal things like about chaos magic, or Raymond Lull, or, you know, I wanted more.
Yeah, for sure. This is very much, it felt like each chapter was written as if it were like an article pitched to like The Believer or something.
Yeah.
And then, so it's like treading lightly on its subject, giving us a lot of gloss on little overlapping aspects of the subject without going super in depth about any one, right? In a way, the Horowitz book was like that too. It was like a lot of history, a lot of quick anecdotes, but not necessarily super in depth, except for on a few of them.
Yeah.
Right? So in a way, there's some cool leads in here too, right? Like, ooh, that's
crazy leads in here.
Tell me more about the people who think that, you know, Nikolai Tesla was a prophet because he spoke to electricity. You know, like, It's just like a few sentences on that, and I'm like, give me the novel. So let's actually, just to get a sense of the kinds of things that are in this book, let me just go through the chapters real quick. There's chapter 1 is golems, which is this. At first, I couldn't figure out why that was technology, but I think I get it now. Golems is like Jewish folktale about a rabbi, I think, who builds this big person out of clay and whispers the name of God into its ear, and it animates and defends the community and so forth. So he talks about the golem and sort of its implications and why it's technology.
And it'll resurface with Automata and Frankenstein.
Yes.
And
but it leads right. So the next chapter is the Automata or whatever, and Frankenstein stuff. And those two are an interesting pairing for different reasons, which we could get into. Then he goes into stage magic and kind of the hucksterism of the spiritualists, or some of them, right? Then he gets into spirit photography, which is this notion that you can take pictures of spirits under the right conditions. Then electronic voice phenomena, which we sort of covered already, is recording the voices of the dead or voices from elsewhere. Then he gets into sort of like technological hacks of the brain, like binaural beats and like strobing lights, or like programmed sequences of sound and light to kind of guide you through altered state of consciousness. And I think that, and then it's just a conclusion after that, right? That kind of wraps it up.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the scope of the things discussed here, right?
So kind of in the beginning with the golem and then the automata,
yeah,
and Frankenstein and such, you do get this theme almost immediately of danger. The human being is capable of creating things that may that it may have a life beyond your purpose.
Right. Yeah, the end of the golem story is that the rabbi summons the golem to defend the community. He does so. He goes out and fucks shit up in the world. Then comes back. The rabbi whispers whatever the off-button spell is, and the thing collapses and kills him. Right.
Right.
So it's kind of a morality tale of like, yeah, this could be good to play God, to take on the power of God and create life in the same way that God does in Genesis. Right. He forms Adam out of clay and breathes into it, and sort of a mimicking of that. But ultimately, that's somehow self-destructive.
And so then from there, he takes us into this chapter where he introduces us to, for my opinion, this character in chapter 2, the horologist. So she's a clock person.
Oh yeah,
Brittany Nico Cox. I thought this woman was fascinating.
Yeah.
And so she's this person in Seattle who her undergraduate degree was in epistemology and metaphysics. That's really fascinating. So what does it mean? What is knowing? What are the root principles behind reality? And then she goes, I think, to a horology school, a watchmaker school.
Yeah.
And she eventually gets a master's degree in something like this. This is all in Britain, highly specialized.
Yeah.
And she learns how to fabricate and make these tools. But her real interest is in the restoration of automatons.
Right.
And did you know much about automatons before?
I knew about them. I didn't know a ton about them. But I guess for people who haven't read the book, an automaton is like imagine a statue of a swan that has a bunch of moving gears and mechanisms inside it and moves in a lifelike way. Like you would see it and think, oh my God, that's a swan. But then you would look a little closer and say, oh my God, it's a statue, right? And in fact, that sense of like, it looks real, I think it's real, but it's not, that sort of the jarring dissonance between those two perceptions is like, I think what he's calling here the uncanny, or the uncanny valley.
Yes,
right?
He's calling it the uncanny, but a big part of the uncanny is the degree of affection and mystique that these things elicit in people.
Yeah.
So, he talks about this, I don't know what Mark Twain loved that swan, but the swan had every feather was constructed, individually, and it could dip its head in the water and it could actually grab fish.
Yeah.
And, it's just and it's all spring powered. That's what really got me.
Right.
It's all spring powered, and then, it could do all these things. And some of these automata could write. They could dip the pen in the inkwell and let it dry.
Right.
You could write different things.
Right.
And that people can get such a deep affection for these things. So the author of the book talks about being in a workshop, and she's working on this old one of a black boy strumming a banjo.
Mm-hmm.
And it's totally in disrepair, and she has to hire people to do new clothes, and it's partially redone. And he says, even looking at it, all busted up and half open, it's got this strange reality to it.
Right.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating and disturbing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can get kind of an experience of that on the cheap by, like, if you had a Furby. Do you not familiar with these toys? Look it up later. It's these creepy little like gremlin like dolls that are really colorful for kids, and they'll go to sleep. And when you walk into the room, they'll go, and they'll wake up and like talk to you and sing different songs, and you interact with it in weird ways, and then it goes back to sleep. So it's like I guess I don't know if you remember going to Chuck E. Cheese as a kid, and there was those robot bands that would like really clumsily move and like sing songs to you. It was just like enough to convince the kid that maybe they were a little bit real.
Right.
It's like that.
If he was small enough, it probably terrified.
Right.
Yeah.
Another example would be if you Google like I don't know if you've seen this, but MIT's been making this like robot horse or robot dog. Have you seen this at all? It's like it's just basically like 4 legs that runs.
Oh, I've seen that.
Over. Yeah. And so you'll watch these videos of them testing it out, and someone will like kick it over, and it will like right itself. But when the person kicks the thing, you think, God, that's an asshole. Like, how can you kick this? Because you feel like you're already like ascribing lifelike properties to this robot as if it were an innocent animal, and then like take its side against the guy who's just trying to demonstrate how it can correct itself, right?
That's what really got me, was the ascribing sentience.
Right.
I mean, I think some religious writers would call this participation. Mm-hmm. Like indigenous cultures can participate in nature and weather and trees and animal, where there's a certain identity between me and the earth, me and the plant.
Right.
But now we're doing it with machines. I mean, apparently we've been doing it with machines for a long time.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's just kind of like the kid who has totally personified the Alexa.
Right.
You know, it's like there's something going on now where we're really beginning to do this. Or the movie, I think, what was it called? She or Her? Where
Her,
fall in love with the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read something real quick.
Yeah.
It really took me. So this is the chapter in the Valley of the Dolls. Automata, as well as any other technology that allows for the supernatural to manifest in the world, gave rise to the true meaning of the word occult, concealed. It is the potential exposure that elicits the feelings of dread. This anxiety is typically rooted in the belief that what is being revealed should remain hidden, at risk of death or in the least heresy. The automaton becomes a form of magic, a tool that disrupts the normal course of things and parts the curtain between the worlds. The persistent idea that through some form of arcane methods, human beings can imitate the most potent of God's attributes is an ancient one, a hope and a fear that our ability to create life from nothingness would thereby ensure our immortality. So it's like there's some sense that these things, as beguiling as they are, they're a violation of something. You're messing with something.
Right. Just like the golem brings the breath of God into the earth, so do the automatons somehow evoke that same experience.
And she said it got so intense during the Renaissance that the Inquisition actually interrogated.
Oh, that's right. Forgot that. Yeah.
Trying to get to the demon and the automaton to speak its, reveal itself.
Right. That's right. There was a guy who was actually going around suggesting that it was actually animate, it was actually alive by some spiritual means that then became, and then I think he backpedaled on that pretty quickly when the, when the Inquisition came
when
around.
I got brought in front of the Inquisition in order to sort of save himself, he revealed the inner,
right,
explain the mechanisms.
Right. Which that, I mean, that little story contains a bunch of themes that are of relevance throughout the book, right? In the quote you just read, he sort of starts by saying that automata are a means to, what does it say, manifest spiritual energy in the world or something.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting. Sometimes I feel like he's being overbold in his claims and not quite saying the reduced version of what he actually means because he wants to punch it up. But
yeah.
I guess the question would be, what is the supernatural that's being made manifest by this machine? Is it when he says it's animated by a demon? Are we supposed to believe that? And that is the supernatural being manifest? But when he reveals it, it's just moving parts, right? It's just man-made.
Right.
So where is the supernatural? Where's the supernatural being made manifest? Is it in my experience of this uncanny moment? Is that the disruption? Or is it, because it's not quite the golem, right? The golem is the literal installation of God's breath in physical matter to walk around. That's, if you saw that walking down the street, that would be something very different than the swan that eats fish and poops, but is actually a wind-up crank machine, right?
Well, it has something, I mean, it also seems to be implying there's some sort of valid human creativity and there's invalid human creativity.
Uh-huh.
That seems to be another theme. You know, you mentioning the golem reminds me, I saw this thing at on the internet. It was some weapons or security kind of convention. They were selling things, and there was this Saudi sheikh or somebody from the oil Emirates, and he was walking along, and he had his bodyguard, who was this enormous robot, just decked out with weapons, and it was moving along.
Right.
I was like, oh my God.
Right. That is, so that's like the MIT robot dog on its hind legs and then murdering people, right?
Yeah. More of a weird RoboCop.
When they weaponize it, that's the end goal, really, right? Yeah, spooky. And I guess we wouldn't look at that and say that it's the spiritual being made manifest in the world, right?
No.
We would say, you've gone. Don't do that. Didn't you see Terminator?
Well, and that's it. And we would say it was demonic, and we wouldn't be tongue in cheek about that.
Right.
What if the owner turns that thing on me? Or what if by some, this is another science fiction trope, but what if it gets away? What if it short circuits or something?
Sure, right. Or like Skynet and Terminator takes over the planet.
Yeah.
Or we become, the Matrix is now real or whatever, right? Yeah. Like we have that sort of sense in our cultural consciousness of like, we're definitely treading on territory that is like one or two steps away from us not being the dominant thing in the world, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a very ancient trope. It's really kind of interesting.
Right. Oh, you're right. It is the same trope as the Golem story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even though
in medieval stuff, there's a thing called an egregore, which is a demon that you create it's much like a golem, by feeding psychic energy into it.
Oh.
And the danger of an egregore is that that's your energy, but it'll eventually come to dominate you.
Right.
Control it, even though you gave it your sustenance to make it.
That's like he mentions servitors in the book, which I think is the chaos magic equivalent of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
It's sort of like taking a part of your consciousness and focusing it into an intention of some kind that lives independently of your consciousness.
Right.
To go do things for you, or to like focus you at certain time. You call upon it to help you achieve a task, or even send it out into the world to go do a thing at distance or whatever. Right?
Well, yeah, and that's what chaos magic does.
Right.
Yeah. So what's interesting is we're here we are. That's the first. It's page 34, the end of that chapter.
Yeah.
And then he shifts us into this chapter called Rough Magic. And now we're into the weird
Theater. Yeah.
Yeah, theater and fraudulence or so it goes from this sort of threatening, menacing thing to this more like you got taken kind of thing.
Well, there's interesting, it certainly is. That's the emphasis of the chapter, I think. At the beginning, he sort of runs these parallels between early religious rituals and it's sort of like being synonymous with theater, like the religious ritual and the early theater are kind of the same thing until they're not. And even then, the theater sort of serves a religious function. And then sort of stage magic, stage special effects, and then the spiritualists and the chicanery or whatever, the tricks,
wrapping and
the
ectoplasm and all these things.
Right, and because like so many of the spiritualists were debunked by Harry Houdini and others, there's like it's all a matter of like sleight of hand and technique, and so he's focused on that aspect of it and comparing that to like ancient religious ritual and also stage magic.
Yeah.
With the themes arising of like, the quote that I really liked from that chapter was this: magic exists and works only because of the unwilling suspension of disbelief. Magic exists and works only because of the unwilling suspension of disbelief, meaning that in order for me to do magic, I have to trick you into bracketing your rational mind, right? I have to like, pull the rabbit out of the hat and you go, what? There was no rabbit. The cat, how did you do that? And that like your skepticism is like outdone by my skill.
Right.
In that case. And so you have to, there's part of you at least that's so impressed that it's either like, I don't know how he did it, but he sure did. Or it's like, maybe there is something to this that I can't explain, right?
Well, that's so interesting you say that, because so we're doing that with artwork. When we read literature, play, but it's still somehow different. It's like,
I think it's in that willingness, unwillingness.
It's the willingness, unwillingness.
If I go to a movie, I willingly suspend disbelief and I say, I don't know, whatever movie we're watching. Okay, it's Star Wars and sure, there can be Jedis. And I'm just going to say the Force is real enough for me to enjoy this movie, right? But when I'm watching The Magician on the stage, and it's even more so when I'm sitting in the room with a medium, there may be a degree of like skepticism that I go in with. But then something happens where that disbelief is suspended against my will.
Yeah.
It shocks me into being unable, at least for a moment, to disbelieve in what's happening.
Right. Or it can be, so I've had my share of experience with that stuff, and I'm not totally credulous. I know a lot of it's bunk, but certain things have happened that like, I don't know how they would know that.
Right.
But by the same token, I still don't think that the person is I'm still able to think that they're either wrong a lot of the time, or maybe charlatans are part of the time, or maybe they believe in what they're doing, and so sometimes they can hit it. Yeah. It's like it suddenly becomes very like mushy.
Yeah. Not 100% real and reliable, but definitely not 100% fake anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. And that pulls us away from this sort of fixed, rational-minded ego into some other state of maybe belief or something like belief. Right?
Well, he says, towards in the epilogue, he says that the enlightenment and rationality and technology and all that, you know, on one hand, it seems to have banished a lot of these things, but we actually use some of those very technologies to re-enchant that we can't.
Right.
We're not really very. We're not thinking. We're not experimenting and rationalizing our way out of this stuff. It won't go away.
Right. Right. And re-enchantment sort of becomes a theme of the end of the book, is like technology does have a certain rationalist thrust to it, right?
Yeah.
The scientification of our minds and our lives is like science knows things, it interprets things, it changes the way we live. We sort of expect to rely on it and its products to improve our lives, and we live entirely within this bubble of techno-scientific trend toward the future all the time, right?
Yeah. It's the closest thing we have to a cosmology.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that the idea that technology can be hacked basically to pop us back out of that bubble is a value, right? Even when it may be like, so the big fraud thing for the spiritualists, I don't know if we talked about this last time, was like the Fox sisters invented table rapping, and it turned out that they were just really good at cracking their toe knuckles, right? They cracked their toe knuckles really loud, and it sounded like a rapping on the table, and they were able to use that as a means to dupe people, and yet that caused a lot of people to change the way they thought about the world. Right?
Oh yeah, and there's a lot of spiritualist phenomena that can't be debunked.
Right, right.
So much so, there's this town in New York. I thought that was fascinating. Lilydale, yeah, where they all congregate.
There's a bunch. Still to this day, there's a lot of spiritualists that come together at that spot and have like different parts of the property or whatever.
Yeah, it's a big summer thing, I think.
Yeah.
But so that kind of brings us to this place where that second artist, who's the one who took the pictures of that stuff, what was her name?
There is a photographer who was doing spiritual photography.
Yeah.
Contemporary artist, not
Shannon Taggart.
Yeah.
And so she takes these photographs, and this was another deficiency of the book. I would have liked a lot more of them.
Sure.
But
cool,
she takes photographs of mediums when they, in the seconds and moments they become inhabited.
Right.
When the spirit guide shows up. And, you know, apparently, what does she do? I don't know photography. Was this a slow shutter speed or something?
Yeah, like a prolonged exposure, so that, like, you know, if I moved my hand like this, it would capture the whole movement, for example.
And she really does capture some really creepy stuff where people's appearances go through these changes.
Right.
But when it's all said and done, she herself doesn't really buy into it. She's totally agnostic about the phenomenon.
Right. And it even sort of says that, you know, she just sort of does everything wrong on purpose, I think, is what she says with photography. She's not trying to capture a still fixed image, but is like trying to capture an image that captures whatever accidents are going on in the moment.
Right.
Opening up the shutter speed, doing the wrong kind of exposure, creating effects that are outside the norm of, like, I guess, realistic photography. That's the thing.
Yeah, she says, I'm only trying to play a part, but I am not trying to clarify anything. And she thinks that these photos, or he says, are a confluence of three things. The camera, so there's your technology. Moment the photo was taken, so she's trying to capture this arrival of the spirit guide, and the viewer of the photo.
Right.
Which is
us.
Right.
And maybe her photos can do that same kind of trick, same kind of effect of, like, pulling us forward into, oh, maybe there's more to this mediumship thing than I would have thought, right? It seems like something's happening there that I can't fully account for.
Right. So it keeps, the book seems on the level to keep circling back to the question of credulity or enchantment on the part of the person looking at the automata or sitting in the audience of this stage magic show.
Right. Yeah, I got, actually, I want to show you this. Check out what I got.
Oh, wow. So that's, yeah.
This is Mary Todd Lincoln posing for a spirit photographer. And you can see behind her the ghost of her assassinated husband 7 years back, Abraham Lincoln. So this is like an early, I just bought this off of eBay, and it's clearly like printed off of some guy's home photo printer or whatever. Probably pulled the image from the internet, right? So it's like a double fake. But this is what early spirit photography looked like. And I think now we can say, well, that's goofy, right? That's like, I could do better than that myself in Photoshop, right?
Right.
But at the time, photography was new, and it was assumed that it could just sort of, it only captured reality.
Yeah.
The camera just took what was there and put it onto the plate.
Right. Nobody questions the technology.
At the time. Now we question video, we question everything, because you got deep fakes and you got everything else, right? It's, how do you know anymore what's real? It's tough. You almost have to be a specialist. But in these days, it was like it captured reality. I can see there's a ghost there, so ghosts are real. And he says in the book that this sort of sent her off the deep end, and it was almost like too much proof.
It was too much for her son, Robert.
Yeah, right. Who had
her spending all kinds of, well, that might have been Horowitz money on this stuff.
Right. But I guess what this represents to me is like this idea that technology can produce a kind of proof, right? A proof that's external to your subjective experience. That like, the book does keep focusing back on like, how am I affected by the stage magician or the spiritualist or by the photography or whatever. But if I can hold this in my hand and I can say, there it is, then that sort of like pulls it out of the realm of just my own experience and gives me something that confirms that.
Right. Which seems to be particularly persistent in human beings around the dead. We either want validation of the afterlife or some sort of communion with those we've lost.
Sure.
You know, what I'm sitting here listening to is, you know, this is the same thing that the people who don't believe in the moon landing do.
Okay.
They look at all those photos of the Apollo on the moon and they say, there's no way.
Right.
This is clunky 1969 technology.
Right.
That's really quite interesting, because you got, like with Mary Todd Lincoln, here's our proof.
Yeah.
And then the passage of time, something about our relationship with technology makes us, it's really interesting.
We've definitely become more skeptical of the images that are presented to us.
Right.
And sometimes in ways that are maybe like over functioning of the skeptical, like quality or whatever. But I mean, if you showed me a moon landing now, I guess I wouldn't know how to tell you if it's real. I'm pretty sure the old ones are real. Like, I'm pretty sure we went to the moon. Buzz Aldrin will punch you in the face if you suggest otherwise. But like, if you showed me one now, I would just assume it's real. But like, if you really challenged me on how do you know, then it falls back into this. I'm relying on the authority of NASA, who right?
Yeah.
Which I don't think is an invalid thing, but it's still like, there's a lot of ways to fake everything now.
There is.
Yeah.
And then you think of these statues that cry, shed tears, and how that won't go away.
Right.
And the Catholic Church sends out investigators to document, to try to invalidate them.
Right. So I guess like, I don't know, that brings up an interesting question of like, to what degree is skepticism useful in normal life and in spirituality, right? Is in some ways, skepticism is this defense against being duped, right? But at the same time, it's kind of a protection against our own vulnerability, a vulnerability which is necessary if you're going to have spiritual experience, I would argue.
Yes.
In order to have contact with something greater, you have to be willing to be wrong and be willing to be tricked and to be willing to be led astray. You have to sort of open yourself to, I don't know what's out there, but I'm willing to believe that there's something, right? And that is a vulnerability that skepticism wouldn't want to allow.
Well, they have good reason for all the shysters and hucksters and cult leaders and
Right.
And the crazy things people will do.
Right.
So it seems like skepticism is healthy. It also seems like skepticism can be enlisted to defend another worldview in almost the same way that the religious person is defending a worldview.
Sure.
And they're both dealing with this liminal phenomena that either validates or challenges.
Right.
So if the statue really is bleeding, then this whole sort of Cartesian rationalist worldview has to make some kind of allowance for that. So it's easier to just outright disbelieve it or to have to say it's some sort of trick or even a psychological thing. You know, sometimes there's an allowance for these things, but it's chalked up to a kind of hysteria or coincidence.
Sure. Oh, coincidence is interesting.
What's that?
I think the coincidence thing is interesting, and I think the more generous psychological interpretations, I guess, are always Jungian, right? Like there's sort of a Jungian play on all this stuff that sort of validates the experience and even the reality of the thing experienced within its own terms.
Yeah, that's it. So, you know, the person saw the Bigfoot and you give them the lie detector test and they pass. But where's the physical evidence? Right. The person was abducted by aliens and they got all this, they got a little metal thing in their ear. But, you know, and that's a funny thing about all this stuff because it gets so tantalizing. It takes you right to the edge of, okay, I can accept it, but it doesn't quite go there, or at least not far enough for most people.
Right. But far enough for some?
Far enough for some. Yeah. Great to look at ourselves in light of that.
Right.
And so then by the time we get into voices, I'm beginning to flag a little bit.
You don't like the tape recording dead people chapter?
No.
That's fun, man. That's cool.
You got into it?
It's okay. So this is the kind of thing I don't know if you watch like Ghost Hunters TV show or like BuzzFeed Unexplained or the kind of like pop paranormal investigation type genre.
Mm-hmm.
They use this kind of stuff when they do that too, right? They have like the scanners. They go beep, 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 spaghetti, beep, 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 beep. And like that's I don't know. That's kind of cool. It's not. It doesn't do it for me in terms of pulling me into a state of suspended disbelief, but it definitely is quirky enough to be entertaining. I felt, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But you got turned off by it. You're saying like, now we're into some bad stuff.
I don't know. It just was like, you know, finding the tape recorders that used to be sold at Radio Shack because they're
right.
I kind of appreciated the do-it-yourself side of this, that people were taking, they're repurposing technologies for finding ghosts and what have you. But it did start getting in that kind of American it started getting like Horowitz's book did. It started getting really zany.
Yeah. It's an interesting like meld between like hacker culture and maker culture, where it's like we're gonna make our own stuff. We're gonna take this Teddy Ruxpin and make it, I don't know, compute pi to the nth degree or whatever. Like doing weird things with tech, and then also the spiritualist thing. So there's like it's the middle of that Venn diagram. So they're hacking old Radio Shack components to try to hear the dead.
Yeah.
So it has that kind of American, we can do it, DIY, almost punk sort of aesthetic.
Yep.
And we're going to do the weirdest thing we can, which is like let you talk to grandpa after he's gone, right?
Well, I thought the thing with one place where it did catch my attention was the Dream Machine, and the way that was this, Byron Geeson and Burroughs and Genesis P. Orridge, and
which is a sort of a shell that spins around a lamp with different cutouts from it, and then it creates a kind of a strobing effect that you would like close your eyes and have flashing lights in different shapes.
Induces theta states much quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like this was the coming back of the Promethean. Mm-hmm. We don't need to fast and go to the monastery. All we need to do is make our dream machine.
Right.
And you know what? It did kind of disturb me. Maybe this is my my recovery getting more conservative as I get older. But when I think of Genesis P. Orridge and Geeson and Burroughs, I'm like, I really wouldn't call any of them spiritual.
No, right. No.
I mean, I call them dark, and I call them edgy, and I call them creative. Mm-hmm. But when you look at their biographies or some of the things they were up to, it's like,
not, yeah.
So that seems to kind of.
Sure. Okay. All right. So yeah, this is definitely the chapter where it hits that button again, or hits that note again of like spirit. Self-referencing, he calls it, spiritual progress in quotes. Right. That's sort of like an experience for its own sake. In this case, generated by technology that doesn't have any ethical ramifications.
Right. No William James in any of this. It's
right.
You're something of a collector of the arcane experience.
Right. Which, okay. But what, how does that? I think I agree with you that my grounding in 12-step sort of ethos says that the payoff of something like that should be a better lived life.
Right.
Payoff of something genuine should be that you're, a little gentler at home than you were before, and a little more compassionate towards people unlike you, a little more open to ideas that you didn't have before or whatever, right? Like there ought to be ramifications in your personal life, not just I'm going to sit in front of this dream machine and I'm going to shoot some dope and then I'm going to do whatever else, right? Like that doesn't seem to.
And I think probably what disturbed me about it is there's so much of my biography that was just collecting the experiences.
Right.
And I could even say there seems to be an this is a truism, but there seems to be an inverse relationship to the strength of the experience and its lasting effect on my life.
Okay, sure.
Super powerful, blow the top of your head off things. Really, I don't know that changed me that much.
Right.
Whereas meditating, praying, trying to help somebody, using techniques over and over again until you get pretty adept at them, even though they're no longer new and exciting.
Just the discipline that grows out of that.
Yeah, it's the discipline. It's not this Promethean thing of, I'll cut through all these layers of meditation with my dream machine and tell you the story.
Right. Right. So that is also where it sort of pushes up most against sort of psychedelic culture. There was a guy who would like develop these glasses with LED flashing lights and like binaural beat sounds that would take your brain through certain, and it was like a microchip program so that it would like create certain brain wave whatevers in patterns that guided you through this experience, right? Yeah. All you had to do was like close your eyes, put the stuff on, and off you go.
Yeah.
You had your accelerated meditation, right? And that's very up against the same kind of ethical situation as like, well, I drop LSD once a year and go to the desert and have my moment, right?
Yeah.
Not that I want to shit on anybody who like values that or it feels like they gain some kind of sustenance from that. I don't know. I wouldn't invalidate the experiences of people who had caught some kind of recovery off of a hallucinogenic experience, right? It does happen.
It does happen.
Right. So like, I'm not saying that's invalid. I'm just saying, and actually in the cases where that does happen, then you do have ethical fallout from an experience like that. I used to be all fucked up and getting high and stealing and lying and had some kind of experience, and I came back. I don't do that anymore. Like I'll endorse that.
But it seems like there's this thing that's like the intensity of the experience coupled with the rapidity or how quickly you can get there.
Yeah.
You know, using some kind of technology, those two things seem to be conspiring to see. That's where I think we're really not in spirituality properly understood anymore.
Right.
I mean, yeah, granted, the effects may be spiritual, they may be deeply mysterious and profound, but it's still very consumer.
Yes. So you know what? Actually, I think it's an interesting comparison. When I was newly sober and we were doing that meeting in the church basement in Farmington, there was a number of people who would come in and start on steps and then have some kind of dramatic third step experience. And they would say, you know, they really felt the presence of God. It was a big deal. It was transformative. They're a different kind of person now. And they had no more interest in going forward in the rest of the steps.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that their third step experience was invalid or not transformative, but there is this real question, just like someone who comes back from an ayahuasca session and says they're sober. That's great. But then there's this question of, well, now what?
Yeah.
You've had this experience that's changed you, but you still have to live your life. And if the only tool you've got is, you know, blow the roof of your head off, that doesn't work so well for, you know, how do I just function in society and take care of the people around me? And
well, and especially if it's constantly receding into the past.
Right.
So I have this big thing in 1982, and here we are in 1994, and all I can do is keep referring back to this thing.
Well, you see that in AA too.
Yeah, I think you saw that in Bill Wilson's biography.
Yeah, he's telling the same story over and over and over and over again, and the story is about back then.
Yeah.
The story isn't this week how I was fucked up and how I relied on God to do the right thing. It's I used to be drunk and then I wasn't drunk and I'm still not drunk.
Yeah. And you can have this too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's almost like there's something that happens with some of these things that they fold in on themselves, and maybe they even fold in on themselves in a communal setting, but they don't have any more relevance to.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Self-referencing spiritual experience. It just confirms its own reality rather than.
And it's easy, and we see people, and I'm certainly guilty of this, you see that you'll move from one to another.
Yeah.
Like, kicks here, I've seen that, okay, I've seen the end of the rainbow here, and now I'm going to go looking for it. You know, it wasn't there, and I'm going to go look for it in this other place.
Yeah.
Any kind of mindset that's doing this.
So the next spiritual fix, the next book, the next method, the next
retreat, the next,
yeah, that just puts a different edge or spin on it that lets you do some, yeah. But it's really kind of the same thing after a while, right? So we kind of spun off from the topic of the book, which is, but the themes are all there. He's very much interested in how that sort of thing happens within the realm of technology. How
right.
we hold and manipulate concrete things in relationship to that.
Well, he does identify a person who kind of, maybe less the ethical issue, a person that, this is somebody that, you know, I'd like to read either his books or a really good biography of him. He's still alive. And this is on 186. This is Jacques Vallée.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacques Vallée is he's the French scientist he's portrayed in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And he doesn't get into it here, but Vallée was the first person to notice that the UFOs, especially the abductee experience, bears striking resemblance to things like encounters with the fairies, various shamanic lore, that, you know, that it looks more like that in some ways than it does nuts and bolts aircraft coming
right
place.
Right.
And the thing about Vallée is he's French, and he, in his youth, had one close encounter. It's just, he saw something in the sky, and he would get a degree, I believe, in astrophysics, but it might have been astronomy. And then he makes the decision to come to the United States because he could see that this is going to be the technological West Coast. And this is like the 1950s probably. And he gets here, and I think it's early computer technology that he gets his doctorate in, something like some kind of engineering. But he is one of the founding figures of ARPANET. He is one of the seminal thinkers of creating the internet. And then at the same time, he would go to the Stanford Research Institute. And he's one of the guys who studied all this stuff as part of conspiracy theory lore, where, you know, all these high-tech guys studied things like remote viewing and, you know, all this crazy stuff. And, you know, he's an investment guy. I mean, he's got these very kind of Silicon Valley credentials, and he's a big UFO guy, and he studies the phenomena, and he studies the abductee experiences. But in the end, he says, I don't know what the hell that is, but it looks like fairy lore. Yeah.
Right.
So he can hold the spiritual, psychological, quasi-Jungian thing, James Campbell, whatever, in the same hand as, you know, okay, we got all these technologies and everything, but is it really advancing anything, or are these just new ways of imagining the spiritual or the paranormal?
Right.
They used to be elves, now they're aliens.
Sure.
And that the technology itself, or the cultural background, changes our imagination of what the phenomenon is.
Right. Well, that's interesting. That's really interesting, actually. You've seen Ancient Aliens? Have you seen the TV show?
You know, I'm like one of the few people that haven't watched it very much.
No. It's not really worth watching in great depth, but it is interesting in this respect of, like, the interpretations are all, like, often going back to ancient texts and ancient images, and then assuming their literal truth, and then reinterpreting it through a technological lens.
Right.
So, I don't know. I can't think of it. Sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's a fiery chariot coming from the sky and coming down to Earth. Well, what would that be if it was real? Well, it would probably be an alien, blah, 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 right? So there's like it's a really weird, like, reconsumption of the spiritual in terms of the technological, that then spiritualizes the technology.
Right.
Which I guess is a sort of, in a way, it's
You're still saying in a literal framework, actually, in a way.
Right.
Because
right.
It's just like the technology we're using right here, just more advanced.
Right.
It's still nuts and bolts technology.
Right.
Whereas what Valet's saying is something more like, no, there's something weird going on. That you can't reduce it to materialism.
Right. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting contrast to the story that didn't get enough attention in my mind in the book was the Mormon transhumanists.
Oh my God, that caught me. Yeah, tell them about that.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting in comparison to him, but it's like, this is a group of Mormons who are all on board with using technology to transform humanity in any way possible, to expand the powers and creativity and agency of humanity in any way, right? Including like uploading their brain to the internet or whatever else, putting our brains in robot bodies and living forever, whatever it is. And the way he describes it is like, Mormonism and transhumanism have this interesting synergy where Mormons believe that all miracles have a material basis, right? Which is not unlike the way that ancient astronaut scholars are trying to interpret phenomena, right? Is like, if it's a miracle, it's true, but also there's some kind of knowable means to evoke it. And there's this sort of ethical call to self-improvement in a way that is not bound by any current limitations of our understanding. In other words, human beings should continue to improve themselves individually and themselves collectively until humanity is ascended. That's almost the most literal version of technological ascendancy in the book.
Yeah.
Right? Is that there's this religious call to improve ourselves with whatever means are available, including understanding the mechanisms behind miracle and becoming almost godlike.
Yeah.
Right? And so that sort of little subculture is fascinating to me. And he just kind of like gives it a couple paragraphs of like, here's an example, and then boop, off he goes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But that frame of mind is like fascinating because it's so different from the way I think about spirituality, but also so like kind of frightening in a way.
Oh, it's totally frightening. And then he has a little throwaway line that he says, and the Mormons, of course, these Mormons argue that Joseph Smith was using technology himself when he had his sky stone.
Right.
He talked to the angel Moroni.
Right.
But listening to is really interesting when you talk about the ancient aliens and, the chariot is really the spaceship and all that.
Yeah.
Because now we've got coming from the psychedelic circles, this guy who's saying that all this biblical stuff, it was all sacramental use of hallucinogens.
Okay. Oh, wait, which guy's saying that?
He's this guy who just wrote this book. It's getting all this press
okay.
now. I can't remember his name.
Right.
But that's kind of interesting because it's not, granted it's an organic substance / spiritual technology, but it's still this idea that it couldn't be, you can't, the hermeneutic is you're not reading the Bible for what the Bible is saying internally. You're supporting this idea that comes from artificial intelligence or tripping balls or something and imposing that on these texts.
Right.
In both cases, you're also reinterpreting the past in light of what we are now and taking it for granted that now is privileged relative to then.
Right. So there's sort of an anachronism to it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think, like, to an extent, we're always doing that.
We are.
Right.
But I think a scholar would always be fighting against it or trying to be aware of it.
That's like almost the definition of biblical scholarship, I think. It's like,
I think so, yeah.
right, to use whatever means are available to like check or bracket off our inevitable like projecting back into the past, right?
It's the old saw that the history tell you more about the historian than what actually happened.
Right, right. But yeah, I mean, the idea, the ancient aliens guy and the hallucinogens guy that are reading into the Bible. I mean, I've definitely been the hallucinogens guy reading into the Bible. I've been that guy. I had a big green Sharpie that I rewrote passages with. That if I still had that copy, it would be really interesting to.
Yeah, we could do a whole show on that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not any kind of coherent anything, but.
Well, there was this one part of the book that was the Piers thinking about what James thought of this.
Okay, yeah, what's that?
So this is where you left out at me on the pages. So it's on page 190.
Okay.
So that means we're in fear and soldering.
Which is sort of the wrap-up chapter, I think.
Yeah, just before the epilogue. And he says, the psychological effect at play is known as pareidolia.
Oh, yeah.
Where the mind is able to take random patterns in sights and sounds and order them into recognizable features, such as seeing animal shapes in clouds or hearing devilish messages in albums played backward. Pareidolia is the phenomenon that allows someone to hear words form in the quickly scanning noises of a ghost box.
Mm-hmm.
Pareidolia also has a long spiritual and religious significance. There's many reported sightings of Jesus, Mary, and other states occurring on the surface of other objects.
Sure.
And so, I mean, you've had pretty intense experience with pareidolia.
Right? Sure. I mean, this is like I made a grilled cheese sandwich and it looks like Jesus, and I'm going to sell it on eBay for $50,000, and everyone's going to be amazed, and it's a miracle, right?
Yeah.
It's like that, or it's like looking up in the clouds and seeing a turtle, or it's like I see something in the corner of my eye. Oh, it's not what I thought. It's all that stuff, right?
But it's also being caught in psychological loops where even though it's not a singular event, it's actually everything is conspiring to deliver these messages. And so the mind at some point now is like stringing things together.
Right. Oh, sure. Right. Like if you turn that up a notch, and it's not just the pile of clothes that I thought was a monster in my room. Now it's all of those moments are somehow orchestrated by an unseen force. Maybe it's the government trying to experiment with my psyche to see if they can get me to be the Antichrist.
Right.
then you're definitely into a pattern reading thing that is psychotic. Meaning that it's just sort of, its ground assumption is not in touch with consensual reality.
Right. Yeah. And this is so fascinating because, people have synchronous experiences in the Jungian definition, meaning something inside of me in the moment matches something outside of me.
Right.
I'm thinking of my buddy, his name's William, and I go by the street sign that says William.
Right.
And if it happens in this kind of discreet way, you might go,
Uh-huh.
And then if something happens as a result of that, the phone rings and it's William. Or you see, at some point, it goes from meaningless to meaningful to, if it keeps going, then we're in that realm. The pareidolia starts.
Sure. Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, it can definitely be, my experience of psychosis resonates with that for sure. And this idea of synchronicity, like I pulled the layer off of reality. Now I can see all the inner workings and the synchronicities of it. But I'm like hyper interpreting it in terms of my own importance and and like a narrative that's not really in check with what's going on.
Although most people that have been through that, and I have too, I can't say that there weren't these really funny pieces in there that
Yes.
were true.
Right.
I'm not sure how it came to me in some way that I don't understand.
Right.
Which is kind of taking us back to the other themes in the book, right?
Mm.
The stage magic, where there was that one guy who says he doesn't see himself as fooling anybody. He sees himself as doing something performative, which will enhance the likelihood of that experience for the audience.
Right. Right. And it's in the performative moment that consciousness is transformed, I think is.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So all of those things seem to be circling back around to the audience, the experiencer.
Right. Right. I like this idea of synchronicity, and I don't know fully what to do with it. But it's a theme that's hinted at, but not totally explored in the book. Right? Like, if you told me spiritual technology, what is the first thing you think of? I might say like tarot deck, right? Which is not like using binaural beats to have meditation, and it's not like a golem or spiritualism, but it's like a technology built to interface with the world, like an aspect of reality that is, I don't want to say this. If synchronicity is true, if it is like an ordering principle of the universe, the way Jung says, there's sort of like causality and then there's synchronicity. Like things cause each other in a series of events, and at the same time, meaningful occurrences conspire together, right? Right, yeah, the acausally, right? They're pulled together, or they happen in a way that is not just I think it's meaningful, but universally corresponded in some way, right? If that's a true thing about the universe, as true as gravity or as true as the speed of light or whatever, then we can interface with that in the same way we can interface with gravity. We can like build machines that operate physically, meaning causally, and we can build machines that operate acausally.
Yeah.
And so, like, in my mind, the tarot deck is a great example of that, or any kind of like divination method is a great example of that, where the assumption is that whatever card comes up, totally random shuffle, a card comes up, that's the one that's going to match the moment for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that's the way reality works, is that meaningful things.
Which is taking for granted that there is an occult, for lack of a better term, reality behind the veneer of this one.
Right. Right. The closest he gets, oh, go ahead.
Well, it's just interesting because in a way, a lot of these technologies in this book are like that in this sense. So even the automata, we know that it's a machine, a finely crafted machine that can be explained in mechanical terms.
Right.
But it has this strange ability to put the viewer into that, some semblance of that place.
Right. Right. As we're talking, I'm wondering about like the value of that. I mean, I like it. I like that feeling. I like going, look at that android. That's freaking me out. But it's sort of like thrills and chills kind of version of spirituality, right? Like in the last book we read, there he talked about, oh, bless you.
Thank you.
In the Horowitz book, there was a piece where he talked about a guru from India coming to the United States during the height of spiritualism, and he said, "You guys are more interested in spooky things than in self-knowledge," right? Which is a bit like this. If I see the automata and I'm pulled into that weird state, does that hang with me? Does that have reverberating effects on my life? Maybe. Or does it just make me think that that kind of experience is controllable and contained and explainable within its own, like I can just compartmentalize that off. oh, well, it was just a machine. So that sense, I can discount it, right?
But it's a little harder to do that with the tarot cards.
I think so.
A little bit harder.
I think it's quite a bit harder. I mean, you can still say, well, it's just random, but that's kind of the point, is that it's just random. And like, if something comes up and it's really deeply revealing and meaningful to you, then you just sort of have to say, I don't know how that works, but there's something to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a way that you can't say, oh, wow, amazing craftsmanship of this swan. People are amazing in their technology, blah, blah, blah. You can't really say the same thing about there's no mechanism behind that that's observable or like, right?
Yeah, either you take it for granted that there's something back there, the cult, or you don't.
Right.
But I would say this seems interesting too. If we just keep, you have this experience with the tarot deck, and then every day for 300 days you're in the tarot deck, I think you're going to get diminishing. I mean, that's one of these things they say about when they do paranormal experiments. The first experiments, they get quite interesting results. The subsequent ones, they diminish.
Right.
I think the same is true for hallucinogens.
Mm.
And it makes me think about the Horowitz book, the guy who did the poetry with the Ouija board.
Yeah.
Because at first he's writing stuff that's winning awards. Well, maybe it don't win awards.
Yeah.
By the end of it, it's like gotten so weird.
Yeah.
With the bat things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, I don't know if that's diminishing returns, but it's certainly like deeper and deeper. Like the arc there of those separate books is like from the human experience, sort of grounded human experience, and then interfacing with this other weird reality.
Yeah.
Into a fully self-referential reality that has no impact on the day-to-day.
Right.
And to me, that seems like a story of loss.
What also seems like kind of a cautionary tale of getting lost in your creation.
Right.
Or the thing that you were a vehicle for or something.
Right. That's sort of, we can see resonances of the rabbi tale of, being crushed by the thing, right? Yeah. Lost in it.
Yeah.
Buried by it.
Yeah. Well, I think we touched a whole bunch of themes that probably follow us into our subsequent reading.
Do we know what we're reading next? Do we have a plan?
No.
Okay.
We'll talk about that momentarily.
Yeah. But that will, I can imagine that these themes will follow us kind of wherever we turn next.
Yeah. All right, my friend. Thank you so much.
Good chat.
Next time.
All right. Bye.